Before we dive into one of World War II's most dramatic technological cat-and-mouse games, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Are you tuning in from London, New York, Berlin, or somewhere else entirely? We love hearing from our global community. The date is March 5, 1943. Somewhere in the Bay of Biscay, under a moonless sky, U-boat U-33 surfaces to recharge its batteries. The crew breathes easier. Their Metox radar detector is silent. No Allied aircraft for miles. They're safe. Then, without warning, the night explodes. A Wellington bomber screams out of the darkness, its lee light blazing like a miniature sun. Depth charges bracket the submarine. The crew scrambles to dive, but it's too late. The attack is over in seconds. The commander's last thought before the boat floods, but Metox gave no warning. How did they find us? This isn't just another World War II story. This is the tale of how British scientists created a technological breakthrough so revolutionary that it rendered an entire German defensive system obsolete overnight, tipping the balance of the war's most crucial campaign. The innovation at the heart of our story, centimetric radar operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength, would prove to be one of the war's genuine game-changers, as significant as breaking the Enigma code or developing the atomic bomb. The stakes couldn't have been higher. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, threatening to starve Britain into submission and cut off the supplies needed for the liberation of Europe. In March 1943 alone, U-boats sank 120 ships totaling 693,000 tons. British historian Stephen Rosekill would later write that the Germans never came closer to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old than in the first 20 days of March 1943. But within 8 weeks, the tide would turn dramatically. In May 1943, Black May, as it became known, the U-boat force would lose 43 submarines, 25% of their operational strength. The monthly loss rate jumped from an average of 10 to 15 boats to a staggering total that exceeded German production capacity for the first time in the war. The primary cause? An invisible new radar that U-boat commanders couldn't detect and couldn't escape. This is how the Allies won the technological arms race that decided the Battle of the Atlantic. To understand the revolution that was coming, we need to understand the world as it existed in late 1942. For 3 years, German U-boats had terrorized the Atlantic Ocean, operating in coordinated wolf packs that stalked Allied convoys carrying food, fuel, weapons, and troops from North America to Britain. These submarines were Germany's most effective weapon, and they were winning. The U-boat was a peculiar weapon of war, lethal underwater but also fundamentally vulnerable. Unlike modern nuclear submarines that could remain submerged for months, World War II U-boats were essentially surface ships that could dive. They relied on diesel engines for surface propulsion and battery power when submerged. But those batteries lasted only a few hours at slow speed, perhaps 1 hour at attack speed. After every patrol, after every evasion, after every attack, U-boats had to surface to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. They also had to surface to refresh their air supply, as the air inside a submerged U-boat quickly became foul with carbon dioxide, diesel fumes, and the accumulated breath and body odor of 50 men packed into a steel tube. For U-boat commanders, night had always been their friend. Under the cover of darkness, they could surface with relative safety. Human lookouts scanning the horizon from aircraft couldn't spot a low-profile submarine against the dark water. The U-boats recharged their batteries, ran their diesels, made good speed to their hunting grounds, and prepared for the next day's attacks. Then, in 1940, the British developed the first air-to-surface vessel radar, designated ASV Mark I. This was revolutionary. Radio waves bouncing off surfaced submarines allowed aircraft to detect them beyond visual range. The technology improved rapidly. By late 1941, ASV Mark II radar, operating on a 1.5-meter wavelength, equipped hundreds of RAF Coastal Command aircraft. For the first time, U-boats could be found at night. But the Germans weren't caught napping for long. In the summer of 1941, a Wellington bomber equipped with ASV Mark II radar crash-landed in North Africa and fell into German hands. German engineers studied the captured radar intensively. They determined its operating frequency, around 200 MHz, and quickly developed a countermeasure. By August 1942, German U-boats began receiving the Metox radar warning receiver, named after its French manufacturer. Metox was brilliantly simple. It listened for radar transmissions on the frequencies used by ASV Mark II. When it detected radar pulses, it converted them into an audible tone in the radio operator's headphones. As the searching aircraft got closer and switched to shorter-range radar modes with higher pulse frequencies, the tone's pitch increased. This gave U-boat crews plenty of warning, often 30 minutes or more, to dive to safety before any attack could develop. The impact was immediate and devastating. U-boat commanders' war diaries from late 1942 were filled with reports of successful radar detection and evasion. A typical entry might read, 2,240 hours. Metox warning. Range estimated 20 kilometers. Dived immediately. Aircraft passed overhead 3 minutes later. U-boat traffic analysts at Bletchley Park, reading these messages after breaking the Enigma code, watched with growing concern as Allied air patrols became increasingly ineffective. The statistics told a grim story. From November 1942 to January 1943, RAF Coastal Command's Bay of Biscay patrols, which covered the routes U-boats took to and from their French bases, failed to sink a single submarine. Not one. Meanwhile, 6 RAF aircraft were lost during the same period. The combination of ASV Mark II radar and the Lee light, which had seemed so promising just months before, had been completely neutralized. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat force, had won the first round of the electronic warfare battle. His submarines once again owned the night. Allied shipping losses climbed steadily through the winter of 1942-43, reaching catastrophic levels by March. Britain's survival hung in the balance. The crisis facing the Allies in early 1943 cannot be overstated. Germany's U-boat force had grown to unprecedented strength. By May 1943, there would be 240 operational U-boats, with 118 at sea simultaneously. German shipyards were producing 20 new submarines per month. The wolf packs were everywhere. The human cost was staggering. Allied merchant sailors faced odds worse than almost any other service. Imagine being torpedoed in the middle of the Atlantic in winter, the water temperature around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. If you survived the explosion and fire, if you managed to abandon ship, you had perhaps 15 minutes in the water before hypothermia rendered you unconscious. Rescue ships, if they came at all, might take hours. Thousands of merchant sailors simply vanished into the Black Atlantic, their deaths marked only by a ship's name removed from the convoy roster. One survivor's account captures the horror. The torpedo struck amidships with a tremendous explosion. The blast threw me against the bulkhead. I could hear men screaming below decks, trapped by twisted metal and rising water. We got 3 lifeboats away, but 2 capsized in the heavy seas. In the third boat, we watched men in the water, calling for help. We couldn't reach them all. One by one, their voices stopped. By dawn, there were only 7 of us left from a crew of 43. 4 RAF Coastal Command aircrews. The frustration was equally intense. They flew endless patrols over empty ocean, their ASV Mark II radar now nearly useless against Metox-equipped U-boats. Squadron leader D.E. Webb wrote in his operations log, "Tonight's patrol, 8 hours, 0 contacts. The U-boats are out there. Enigma intercepts confirm heavy traffic through the bay. But we cannot find them. Metox has made our radar obsolete. We fly, we search, we return empty-handed while ships die." The numbers painted a devastating picture. In March 1943, wolf packs mauled convoy after convoy. Convoy SC-122 and HX-229, sailing separately but converging in the North Atlantic, were attacked by a combined wolf pack of 38 U-boats. In a running battle lasting 4 days, 21 merchant ships totaling 141,000 tons were sunk. Only 1 U-boat was lost. It was the largest convoy battle of the entire war, and the U-boats had won decisively. Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, faced a nightmare scenario. "At current loss rates," he wrote to the Admiralty, "we cannot sustain the convoy system beyond autumn. The mathematics are simple and brutal. We are losing ships faster than America can build them. Without merchant shipping, Britain starves. Without supplies, we cannot launch the second front. Without the second front, we cannot win the war." Winston Churchill, never one for understatement, was genuinely frightened. "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril," he would later write in his memoirs. In March 1943, his fear seemed justified. The U-boats were winning. But the technological challenge went beyond just detecting submarines. The Allies had attempted multiple solutions, each with its own limitations. The Lee light system, brilliant as it was, required aircraft to get within about 1 mile of the target before illumination. With Metox providing warning at 20 to 30 kilometer range, U-boats simply dived long before the Lee light became effective. The lights remained useful, but only when the element of surprise could be maintained, and Metox had eliminated surprise. Improved depth charges and tactics helped, but only if you could find the submarine in the first place. ASV Mark II radar could spot a surfaced U-boat at 10 to 15 miles in good conditions, but Metox could detect ASV transmissions at 30 miles or more. The U-boat always had time to dive. Even breaking the Enigma code provided limited help. Yes, the Allies could sometimes route convoys around known wolf-pack positions, but they couldn't be everywhere, and U-boats were numerous. What was desperately needed was a way to detect U-boats that couldn't be detected in turn. The problem was electromagnetic physics. Metox receivers were designed to detect radio waves around 1.5 meters in wavelength, 200 megahertz. To remain undetectable, the Allies would need radar operating on a completely different wavelength, one that German receivers couldn't pick up. But building such a radar presented enormous technical challenges. At the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern in England, British scientists understood the solution in theory: move to much shorter wavelengths, to centimetric radar operating around 10 centimeters instead of 1.5 meters. Such radar would be invisible to Metox. But could it be built? Could it be made small enough and reliable enough for use in aircraft? Could it be produced in sufficient quantities? Time was running out. Every day brought new reports of merchant ships torpedoed, convoys scattered, sailors lost. The scientists knew what needed to be done. Now they had to make it work before Britain's lifeline was severed permanently. The race was on. The breakthrough that would save the Atlantic campaign had actually occurred 3 years earlier, in a laboratory far removed from the fighting. In February 1940, at the University of Birmingham, 2 physicists named John Randall and Harry Boot were working on a peculiar device called a cavity magnetron. Magnetrons weren't new, they'd been around since the 1920s, but Randall and Boot's version was revolutionary. By drilling precisely machined cavities into a copper cylinder and placing it in a magnetic field, they created a device that could generate powerful microwave radiation at very short wavelengths. On February 21, 1940, their prototype produced 400 watts of continuous power at 9.8 centimeters wavelength. Within months, improved versions generated kilowatts of power in short pulses, more than enough for radar. The cavity magnetron was beautifully simple and remarkably robust. Unlike the fragile vacuum tubes used in conventional electronics, the magnetron's core component was a solid block of copper. It could withstand rough handling, temperature extremes, and high vibrations. Even if an aircraft crashed, the magnetron might survive intact, a fact that would have profound consequences. British scientists immediately recognized the magnetron's potential for radar. Shorter wavelengths meant smaller antennas, tighter beams, better resolution, and higher performance. By late 1940, development teams were working on 2 microwave radar systems: ASV Mark III for night fighters to intercept bombers, and H-2S ground mapping radar to help bombers navigate and identify targets at night. The H-2S radar was particularly innovative. Installed in a rotating dome under the bomber's fuselage, it created a map of the ground below by detecting the different radar reflections from cities, forests, fields, and water. By 1942, with the RAF's bombing campaign in full swing, development of H-2S became a top priority. Winston Churchill personally ordered 200 sets operational by mid-October 1942, though no working system yet existed. Here's where the story takes a crucial turn. The same H-2S radar designed for bombers could, with minor modifications, serve as an anti-submarine search radar. Water reflects radar differently than land, and a surfaced submarine presents a distinct radar target. Scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment realized this early on and proposed adapting H-2S for coastal command. They called it ASV Mark III. But there was a problem, actually, several problems. RAF Bomber Command wanted all available magnetrons for H-2S. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, was planning the strategic bombing offensive against Germany and considered his requirements paramount. Coastal Command's needs were secondary. The debate reached the highest levels. Should the precious cavity magnetrons go to bombers attacking German cities, or to patrol aircraft hunting U-boats? 4 months through late 1942, Bomber Command won the argument. Nearly all magnetron production went to H-2S for bombers. Then U-boat losses started climbing in the winter of 1942-43. The Metox-equipped submarines were evading ASV Mark II radar with ease. Shipping losses surged. Suddenly, the anti-submarine mission looked critical again. In March 1943, after the devastating convoy battles, a compromise was reached. Magnetron production would be split roughly 60-40 between Bomber Command and Coastal Command. Development proceeded rapidly once resources were allocated. The ASV Mark III radar was essentially H-2S in a different mounting. Instead of looking down at the ground, it scanned the ocean surface. The antenna, a rotating dish about 28 inches in diameter, was installed in the nose of Wellington bombers or under the wings of Sunderland flying boats. On American Liberators, it went into a distinctive chin radome. The radar operator watched a circular display called a Plan Position Indicator, or PPI. The screen showed a map view, with the aircraft at the center and radar contacts appearing as bright spots. A surfaced U-boat would show up as a distinct blip, and the operator could track its position, range, and movement in real time. Here's what made ASV Mark III so revolutionary. Operating at 10 centimeters wavelength, 3000 MHz, it was completely invisible to Metox receivers tuned to 1.5 meters, 200 MHz. The difference in frequency was so vast that detecting one with a receiver designed for the other was like trying to see infrared light with your naked eyes. Physically impossible. Better yet, the shorter wavelength provided better resolution and range. ASV Mark III could detect a surfaced U-boat at 10 to 15 miles in good conditions, sometimes farther. The tighter beam reduced interference from waves and improved target identification. Operators could actually distinguish a submarine from a fishing boat or piece of wreckage. The first operational ASV Mark III systems reached 172 Squadron in late February 1943. The Wellington crews trained intensively on the new equipment. On the night of March 1 to 2, 1943, 2 aircraft flew the first operational patrols over the Bay of Biscay. They saw nothing that night, though ironically they were jumped by German night fighters and had to use the radar defensively to evade them. The breakthrough came March 5, exactly as described in our opening. Wellington aircraft attacked U-33 in the Bay of Biscay. The submarine's Metox gave no warning. The attack came out of nowhere. The boat survived, but the crew was shaken and confused. The next night, March 6, the same thing happened to U-156 on the other side of the Atlantic. Again, no Metox warning. Again, an attack that seemed to materialize from empty darkness. In the operations rooms at U-boat headquarters in Paris, staff officers plotted these incidents with growing concern. 2 attacks in 2 days, both reporting no radar warning, both in areas where aircraft shouldn't have been able to detect them. What was happening? March 17 brought the first kill. Wellington H-538 of 172 Squadron, piloted by squadron leader John Greswell, detected a submarine at 9 miles. The lee light malfunctioned, but they pressed the attack anyway and depth-charged the target. The next night, March 18, the same aircraft found another U-boat at 7 miles. This time, everything worked perfectly. The lee light blazed, depth charges fell, and the U-boat was destroyed. By the end of March, 13 sightings had been made using ASV Mark III. Production ramped up rapidly through April and May. The new radar equipped Wellingtons, Liberators, Halifaxes, Sunderlands, and Catalinas. By May, Coastal Command had dozens of aircraft with the new technology, and they were swarming the Bay of Biscay and the North Atlantic convoy routes. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for the U-boats. In April, sightings in the Bay of Biscay increased sharply. It seemed as though patrol aircraft were finding every submarine that surfaced. Commanders reported being attacked multiple times per patrol. Some boats took so much damage from repeated air attacks that they had to abort their missions and return to base. The innovation had worked beyond anyone's expectations. ASV Mark III radar had restored the element of surprise to Allied air patrols. U-boat commanders, accustomed to Metox's reliable warnings, suddenly found themselves blind and vulnerable again. But here's the most remarkable part of this story. Despite having captured a Magnetron in February 1943, the Germans didn't realize for months that it was being used against submarines. The captured Magnetron came from an H-2S-equipped bomber shot down over Rotterdam. German engineers studied it intensively and began developing their own microwave radars. But somehow, the intelligence never reached the Kriegsmarine, or if it did, naval engineers dismissed the possibility that such technology could be adapted for anti-submarine warfare. By the time they figured it out, it was too late. May 1943 would go down in U-boat history as Black May, the month the Atlantic turned red with German blood. The statistics tell a story of catastrophic defeat. In May 1943, despite having 240 operational U-boats, the highest number of the entire war, the Kriegsmarine lost 43 submarines, 43 boats, 25% of operational strength, gone in 30 days. Of those losses, 14 were attributed to aircraft, 6 of them in the Bay of Biscay alone, and most of those aircraft were equipped with ASV Mark III. Let's put those numbers in context. German shipyards were producing roughly 20 U-boats per month. May's losses were more than double production capacity. More submarines than had been lost in all of 1941. Nearly 3 times the previous monthly record. Unsustainable by any measure. For the men serving in U-boats, May 1943 was a month of terror. The survival rates tell the story starkly. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 died, a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any service in any combatant nation. Many of those deaths occurred after May 1943, when the Allied advantage became insurmountable. Individual stories bring home the human dimension of this technological triumph. Take U-563, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Klaus Bargston. On May 31st, U-563 was transiting the Bay of Biscay on the surface. It was late afternoon, clear weather, good visibility. The crew maintained sharp lookouts, eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale speck that meant aircraft. Wing Commander Wilfred Olton of 58 Squadron approached through scattered clouds, his Wellington's ASV Mark III tracking the submarine from 15 miles out. He positioned the sun behind him and dove out of the clouds at high speed. The U-563's lookouts never saw him coming. Olton's depth charges straddled the boat perfectly. U-563 began trailing oil and losing speed. He called in additional aircraft. Over the next hour, multiple aircraft attacked. A Sunderland from 10 Royal Australian Air Force Squadron made 2 passes, the second of which stopped the submarine dead in the water. Men appeared on deck in life jackets. Then a second Sunderland from 228 Squadron arrived and made a third attack. The depth charges exploded among the crew on deck. Bodies were thrown into the air. U-563 sank with all hands, 48 men lost. For this action, Olton received the Distinguished Service Order. But the true hero was the invisible radar beam that had found U-563 from beyond visual range, on a clear day when human lookouts should have spotted the aircraft first. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was devastating. Commanders who had trusted Metox implicitly suddenly found themselves being attacked without warning. The night, once a sanctuary, had become a killing zone. Some commanders began questioning whether their radar detectors were malfunctioning. Others wondered if the Allies had developed some entirely new detection method. The confusion is evident in the radio traffic from May 1943, intercepted and decrypted by Allied intelligence. One U-boat commander radioed, "Attacked by aircraft 1,430 hours. Metox gave no warning. Considerable damage. Returning to base." Another, "Under repeated air attack. Radar detector silent. How are they finding us?" A third, "Request clarification on enemy detection methods. Metox appears ineffective." At U-boat headquarters, Admiral Karl Donitz and his staff struggled to understand what was happening. They knew something had changed dramatically, but what? German intelligence officers reviewed every scrap of information, every captured document, every prisoner interrogation report. Here's where the story takes a bizarre turn. The Germans had actually captured a cavity magnetron back in February 1943 when the short Stirling bomber carrying H-2S radar was shot down over Rotterdam. German scientists code-named it the Rotterdam Gerät, Rotterdam device, and formed a study group to exploit it. They met at Telefunken offices in Berlin on February 22 and quickly realized the Magnetron's potential. But somehow, the information didn't reach the people who needed it most. Either the intelligence failed to reach the Kriegsmarine, or naval engineers dismissed it as irrelevant to anti-submarine warfare. The disconnect was so complete that in August 1943, 5 months after ASV Mark III entered service, German Naval High Command was still blaming something entirely different for their losses. That something else was a masterpiece of Allied deception. A captured RAF officer, probably during interrogation, claimed that RAF aircraft carried a device that could detect Metox receiver emissions. He said that Metox receivers, while listening for radar, inadvertently radiated weak signals at their intermediate frequency, and the RAF had built detectors that homed in on those emissions. This was technically plausible. Radio receivers can radiate weak signals, but it wasn't true. The RAF had no such device. Yet German engineers, checking their equipment, found that yes, Metox receivers did emit detectable radiation. The explanation fit their observations. They believed it. On August 15, 1943, a radio message went out to the entire U-boat fleet: turn off Metox immediately. Enemy detecting our receivers. Do not use radar warning equipment until further notice. This was a catastrophe compounded by deception. Not only were U-boats blind to the real threat, ASV Mark III radar, but they'd also been ordered to turn off the one device that could still detect older ASV Mark II radar, which remained in use on many aircraft. U-boats were now completely defenseless against both radar types. Meanwhile, Allied shipping losses plummeted. In May 1943, 58 ships totaling 299,000 tons were lost, of which only 34 ships, 134,000 tons, were sunk in the Atlantic. Compare this to March's losses of 120 ships, 693,000 tons, and the turnaround is stunning. In June and July, losses continued declining while U-boat casualties remained catastrophic. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Donitz made a decision that effectively conceded defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. He ordered most U-boats withdrawn from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic for 3 years were pulled back. The U-boat offensive, which had brought Britain to the brink of starvation, was over. Donitz would later write in his memoirs, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He attributed the defeat to several factors: improved convoy escorts, escort carriers, long-range aircraft, and a new type of radar against which our search receivers were powerless. Allied shipping could now move more freely. The supplies, troops, and equipment needed for D-Day could accumulate in Britain without crippling losses. The Second Front became possible. The tide of war had turned, and a large part of that turning was due to invisible electromagnetic waves at 10 centimeters wavelength. By September 1943, the Germans finally developed Naxos, a radar warning receiver that could detect centimetric radar. But it was too little, too late. Naxos had a detection range of only about 8 kilometers against ASV Mark III, giving U-boat crews perhaps 60 seconds warning before attack. And the Allies were already developing ASV Mark VI and Mark VII, operating at even shorter wavelengths that Naxos couldn't detect. The technological advantage had decisively shifted to the Allies, and it would never shift back. The story of ASV Mark III radar and the defeat of the U-boat menace offers profound lessons that echo through history, relevant far beyond World War II's anti-submarine warfare. First and foremost, this is a story about the decisive role of scientific innovation in modern warfare. The cavity magnetron, a piece of physics so fundamental it's now taught in undergraduate courses, changed the course of the war. 2 physicists working in a laboratory at the University of Birmingham created a device that would help save Britain from starvation and enable the liberation of Europe. Science mattered. Research mattered. Understanding the electromagnetic spectrum mattered as much as understanding tactics or strategy. The contrast with Germany is instructive. German scientists had actually developed magnetron-like devices before the war but abandoned the research, believing centimetric wavelengths would never be practically useful for radar. When they captured a British magnetron in February 1943, they recognized its sophistication but moved too slowly to exploit the knowledge. In warfare, the side that innovates faster often wins, regardless of initial technological position. Second, This story illustrates the critical importance of intelligence and counterintelligence. The Allies' ability to deceive the Germans about why their Metox receivers had become ineffective bought crucial months during which U-boats operated essentially blind. The captured RAF officer's claim about Metox radiation detection was either brilliant improvisation or fortunate coincidence, but its effect was devastating to German morale and tactical effectiveness. Conversely, the German failure to connect their captured Magnetron to their submarine losses shows how intelligence failures happen. The information existed. The hardware was in their hands. But institutional barriers, bureaucratic delays, or simple failure of imagination prevented them from putting the pieces together until too late. In modern military terms, this was a failure of all-source intelligence integration, different organizations knowing different pieces of the puzzle but not communicating effectively. Third, this is a story about the nature of technological competition in warfare. The radar versus search receiver battle exemplified what we now call an action-reaction cycle, or Red Queen race, both sides constantly innovating to counter the other's countermeasures. ASV Mark II led to Metox. Metox led to ASV Mark III. ASV Mark III led to Naxos. Naxos led to ASV Mark VI and VII. Neither side could stop innovating without losing. This cycle continues today in electronic warfare, cyber warfare, and stealth technology. Modern military forces invest billions in radar, infrared sensors, and satellites to detect threats, while adversaries invest billions in stealth, deception, and electronic countermeasures. The ASV versus Metox battle of 1943 established patterns that define military technology competition to this day. Fourth, consider the human dimension. Behind every technological innovation stand individual people making choices. John Randall and Harry Boot working late nights to perfect the Magnetron. Squadron leader Humphrey de Verde Lee developing his searchlight system without official approval. Wing commander Wilfred Olton perfecting his attack techniques. The anonymous RAF officer who may have deliberately fed false information to German interrogators. Each of these individuals, through courage, persistence, and creativity, contributed to the outcome. On the German side, we see U-boat crews displaying remarkable bravery even after they knew the odds had turned against them. Commanders who continued patrolling even after friends and colleagues failed to return. Crews who remained at their posts even after repeated aircraft attacks. Engineers who frantically tried to develop Naxos and other countermeasures even as the U-boat force bled out. Courage existed on both sides. Technology determined who lived and who died. Fifth, this story reminds us that wars are often won or lost by unsexy, technical advantages that the public never sees or understands. ASV Mark III radar lacks the dramatic appeal of fighter aces, commando raids, or tank battles. Most people have never heard of it. Yet it arguably had more impact on the war's outcome than any single conventional military engagement. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't decided by a climactic naval battle like Jutland or Midway. It was decided by cumulative technological and tactical advantages that made U-boat operations increasingly costly until they became unsustainable. Shipping statistics, production figures, and loss rates determined the outcome more than any individual act of heroism. This challenges our narrative preferences. We prefer stories of dramatic battles and individual heroes. But modern warfare is increasingly about systems, sensors, supply chains, and statistics. The winners are often those who do the boring work better, build more ships, develop better radar, organize logistics more efficiently, train crews more thoroughly. Sixth, timing matters enormously. If ASV Mark III had entered service 6 months earlier, the shipping crisis of early 1943 might never have occurred. If it had arrived 6 months later, Britain might have faced famine, D-Day might have been delayed, or the strategic bombing campaign might have faltered. The cavity magnetron was invented in February 1940, but ASV Mark III didn't become operational until March 1943, 3 years later. How many ships and lives were lost in that interval? The lesson for modern military planning is clear. Shortening the cycle from research to deployment is as important as the quality of the technology itself. A good weapon fielded today beats an excellent weapon fielded next year. Seventh, this story shows how deception and psychological factors can multiply technological advantages. Even after Germany developed Naxos in September 1943, the psychological damage was done. U-boat crews no longer trusted their equipment. Morale plummeted. Experienced commanders became cautious or fatalistic. The Allies' technological edge was real, but the perceived edge was even greater. Modern military theorists call this escalation dominance, not just having an advantage, but having your adversary believe your advantage is insurmountable. The U-boat force after May 1943 wasn't just technologically defeated, it was psychologically defeated. Crews knew they were sailing into the valley of death, and that knowledge affected performance, decision-making, and combat effectiveness. Finally, this story teaches us about the asymmetric nature of maritime warfare. Germany never matched Allied shipbuilding capacity. American shipyards alone produced over 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. The U-boat campaign was Germany's asymmetric response, trying to sink ships faster than they could be built using relatively cheap submarines. But once the Allies developed effective countermeasures, the asymmetry reversed. Now U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could build them, while Allied merchant shipping production accelerated. The parallel to modern asymmetric warfare is obvious. Asymmetric strategies work until the stronger power develops effective counters, at which point the asymmetry becomes a liability. Germany's U-boats went from being cost-effective ship killers to expensive coffins once ASV Mark III entered service. The broader strategic lesson? In total war between industrialized powers, technological innovation combined with industrial capacity usually defeats tactical cleverness alone. Germany had excellent tactics, brave crews, and sophisticated submarines. The Allies had better radar, more ships, and bigger factories. The Allies won. What can we take away from this story today? In our age of cyber warfare, drone swarms, artificial intelligence, and hypersonic missiles, the lessons of ASV Mark III remain surprisingly relevant. Innovation matters more than tradition. The winning technology came from basic physics research, not from experienced naval officers or submarine experts. Sometimes the breakthrough comes from outsiders who don't know what's impossible. Speed of adaptation beats initial superiority. Germany had excellent submarines and tactics, but Britain adapted faster when circumstances changed. Institutional agility and willingness to adopt new technology quickly can overcome initial disadvantages. Intelligence integration is as important as intelligence collection. Germany captured a Magnetron but failed to connect it to submarine losses until too late. Having information doesn't help if different parts of your organization don't communicate effectively. Deception can multiply the impact of technology. The false story about Metox detection bought the Allies crucial months. In modern terms, we might call this information operations or perception management. Psychological factors can outlast technological advantages. Even after Naxos gave warning capability back to U-boats, the damage to morale and confidence couldn't be repaired. Once you've lost the psychological edge, regaining it is extraordinarily difficult. Systems beat heroism. Individual courage and skill mattered, but ultimately the side with better sensors, better coordination, better logistics, and better production won. Modern warfare is about systems, and the best system usually wins. As we close, consider this: the cavity magnetron that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic didn't just win a war. The same technology revolutionized peacetime life. After the war, miniaturized magnetrons became the heart of microwave ovens, found in hundreds of millions of homes worldwide. The radar technology pioneered for finding submarines evolved into air traffic control systems, weather radar, and countless other applications. That's often how it works. Military necessity drives innovation, but the innovations outlive the conflict and transform civilian life. The scientists who developed ASV Mark III probably never imagined that their grandchildren would use descendants of their radar to check the weather forecast or heat up dinner. The story of ASV Mark III radar is ultimately a story about human ingenuity in the face of existential crisis. When Britain stood alone, when shipping losses threatened national survival, scientists, engineers, aircrews, and leaders came together to create a solution. They didn't just adapt existing technology, they created something genuinely revolutionary and deployed it with remarkable speed and effectiveness. Admiral Karl Donitz had once said, "The U-boat alone can win this war for Germany, or at least prevent her losing it." He was wrong. The U-boat couldn't win once Allied scientists learned to see in wavelengths the human eye couldn't detect and U-boat receivers couldn't sense. In the end, invisible light at 10 centimeters wavelength proved more powerful than torpedoes, more deadly than depth charges, and more decisive than naval gunfire. The Battle of Atlantic was won not by the biggest guns or the bravest sailors, but by physicists who understood that shorter wavelengths meant better radar, and engineers who turned that understanding into working equipment that could find submarines in the dark. The U-boat captains panicked not because they faced superior firepower, but because they faced something they couldn't understand, couldn't detect, and couldn't escape. They were being hunted by invisible electromagnetic waves, and in that invisible light, they could find nowhere to hide. The night, once their refuge, had become their grave.